The bullets whistled through the dense chaparral like angry hornets, splintering branches and embedding themselves in tree trunks as Captain Samuel Walker's Texas Rangers dove for cover. It was the afternoon of May 8, 1846, and the opening shots of what would become one of the Mexican-American War's most consequential engagements had just been fired. The battle that would follow at Resaca de la Palma would forever alter the destinies of two proud nations. Just one day earlier, American forces under General Zachary Taylor had clashed with Mexican troops at Palo Alto, resulting in an American victory that forced the Mexican army to retreat southward. Now, as the sun climbed high in the Texas sky, both armies prepared to face each other once more in a ravine locally known as Resaca de la Palma, the dry river of palms. General Mariano Arista, commander of the Mexican forces, had chosen his position with care. The Resaca, a former channel of the Rio Grande, offered natural defensive advantages with its steep banks and dense vegetation. As his 6,000 men fortified their positions among the thorny mesquite and chaparral, Arista believed the terrain would neutralize the American advantage in artillery that had proven so decisive at Palo Alto. The Mexican position at Resaca de la Palma represented a textbook defensive arrangement, noted military historian Robert Selby in his seminal work, Contested Borderlands. Arista's deployment demonstrated his understanding that the dense chaparral would fragment American units and disrupt their command structure. 4 miles to the north, General Taylor's camp buzzed with activity. The 47-year-old commander, known affectionately as Old Rough and Ready by his men, paced thoughtfully outside his tent. Despite yesterday's victory, Taylor had lost. Just 15 men killed, but another 43 were wounded. Every loss weighed heavily on him, but he knew his mission to secure the disputed territory between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande was far from complete. "Gentlemen," Taylor addressed his assembled officers, his voice calm but resolute, "we will advance today and engage the enemy. They have chosen their ground, but we shall demonstrate that American arms are superior regardless of terrain." Captain Walker, whose Rangers had been scouting the Mexican positions, reported to Taylor that Arista had positioned his forces in the Resaca with infantry on both flanks, artillery commanding the road, and cavalry units held in reserve. Taylor listened intently, occasionally asking pointed questions about the visibility within the chaparral and the condition of the road. Lieutenant Ulysses S. Grant, a young officer who would later rise to commanding heights during the American Civil War, described the atmosphere among the troops. There was no bravado among the men, merely a quiet determination. Most had seen combat for the first time the previous day, and that experience had transformed them from green recruits to soldiers who understood what would be required of them. As midday approached, Taylor issued his orders. The American forces, numbering roughly 2,000 men, would advance directly along the road toward the Mexican position. Major William H. Brown would lead the right wing with the 7th Infantry, while Lieutenant Colonel William McIntosh would command the left. With the 8th Infantry, the 4th Infantry would remain in reserve, and the artillery would advance up the center to challenge the Mexican guns. The men ate a hasty meal of salt pork and hardtack. Water was scarce, and the Texas heat unrelenting. Veterans helped newer. Soldiers checked their weapons one final time. The single-shot muskets could not afford to misfire in the coming engagement. Officers moved among their companies, offering quiet words of encouragement or stern reminders of duty. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Taylor gave the command to advance. Drums beat the forward march, and the American line began to move through the scattered trees and undergrowth toward the Resaca. The men moved quietly, the only sounds the jingling of equipment and the crunch of boots on dry soil. What no one yet realized was that this engagement would not only determine control of the disputed territory, but would set the stage for a conflict that would ultimately see Mexico lose nearly half its national territory. The fates of countless souls hung in the balance as the American forces approached the battlefield at Resaca de la Palma. The chaparral thickened as the American forces advanced, the thorny vegetation clawing at uniforms and equipment. By 3 o'clock on the afternoon of May 9, 1846, the advance guard of skirmishers under Captain George McCall made first contact with Mexican pickets, who fired a volley before melting back into the dense brush. "The enemy is directly ahead," McCall reported to General Taylor, who had ridden forward to assess the situation. The general's weathered face betrayed no emotion as he surveyed the terrain ahead. The road narrowed as it dipped into the Resaca, and from their position, they could now hear the Mexican drums beating an alert. "Lieutenant Ridgely," Taylor called to his artillery commander, "bring your battery forward. We will test their center." Randolph. Ridgely, a 29-year-old West Point graduate commanding a section of the 3rd Artillery, immediately ordered his men to advance with their 4 18-pounder cannons. The heavy guns rumbled forward along the road, wheels creaking under their weight, teams of horses straining against their harnesses. From his command position on the southern bank of the Resaca, General Arista observed the American approach through his brass spyglass. Beside him stood General Romulo Diaz de la Vega, who commanded the center of the Mexican line. "They come directly at us, General," Diaz de la Vega remarked. "Shall we commence artillery fire?" Arista nodded grimly. "Yes. Let us welcome the North Americans appropriately." According to historical accounts from Captain Fernando Balbontin's La Invasión Americana, what followed was a thunderous exchange of artillery that shook the earth and filled the ravine, with dense smoke, obscuring vision and transforming the battlefield into a chaotic hell. The Mexican battery, consisting of 8 pieces positioned to command the road, opened fire first. Their shots tore through the American ranks, killing several men in the 5th Infantry and sending others diving for cover. Ridgely's guns responded, immediately, firing with remarkable precision despite the difficult terrain. Meanwhile, Taylor ordered his infantry to deploy on both sides of the road. The challenge was immense. The chaparral was so dense that officers often could not see their own men just yards away. Unit cohesion began to fragment as soldiers struggled through the tangle of vegetation, losing sight of their comrades and sometimes wandering into enemy positions unexpectedly. Captain Charles May, commanding a squadron of the 2nd Dragoons, approached Taylor amidst the growing chaos. May, notable for his flowing dark beard that reached his waist, saluted sharply. "General, request permission to charge the Mexican battery," he said, his voice steady despite the shells exploding nearby. Taylor studied the dashing cavalry officer for a moment. "Charge, Captain May," he replied. "Take those guns at all hazards." May returned to his dragoons, drew his saber, and addressed his men. "We are going to charge the enemy's battery. Follow your officers." With that, 70 mounted dragoons thundered down the road toward the Mexican artillery position, sabers gleaming in the afternoon sun. The Mexican gunners, seeing the cavalry charge forming, redirected their fire from the American infantry to the approaching horsemen. Several dragoons fell, but the momentum of the charge could not be broken. Lieutenant Ng, leading the 1st platoon, was killed instantly by grapeshot just yards from the Mexican guns. May himself leapt his horse over one of the cannons, landing amidst the stunned Mexican artillerymen. In the ensuing melee of slashing sabers and desperate hand-to-hand combat, the dragoons momentarily captured the battery, but the victory was short-lived. Mexican infantry surged forward from protected positions in the chaparral, forcing the dragoons to retreat after having lost nearly a third of their number. However, they had succeeded in capturing General Diaz de la Vega, who had rushed to the defense of his guns and found himself surrounded by American cavalrymen. As May withdrew with his prisoner, the infantry battle intensified on both flanks. The 8th Infantry under Colonel Belknap became entangled in a vicious firefight on the American left, while the 5th Infantry under Lieutenant Colonel McIntosh pushed through almost impenetrable brush on the right, often encountering Mexican soldiers at point-blank range. "The fighting in the chaparral defied all conventional military tactics," wrote Colonel William S. Henry in his memoir, Campaign Sketches of the War with Mexico. Men fought as individuals rather than units, often unable to see more than a few feet in any direction. The sounds of battle, gunfire, shouted orders, cries of the wounded, seemed to come from everywhere at once, disorienting even the most experienced soldiers. By 4 o'clock, the battle had devolved into dozens of small savage engagements throughout the Resaca. The fate of the day hung in the balance as both armies struggled for supremacy in one of the most challenging battlefields of the Mexican-American War. The battle reached its crescendo as the afternoon wore on. Lieutenant Colonel James McIntosh, leading elements of the 5th Infantry through the right flank of the chaparral, suddenly found himself face to face with a Mexican infantry company. In the ensuing firefight, McIntosh's horse was shot from under him, and as he struggled to free himself from the fallen animal, a Mexican soldier thrust a bayonet into his mouth, severely wounding him. Despite the grievous injury, the colonel continued to lead his men forward, blood streaming down his uniform. On the American left, Colonel William Belknap led the 8th Infantry in a series of charges against Mexican positions. During one such advance, Belknap personally seized a Mexican officer by the collar and dragged him back to American lines as a prisoner. This bold action so demoralized nearby Mexican troops that an entire section abandoned their position. The character of this engagement was unlike any other in recent military history, noted military correspondent George Wilkins Kendall of the New Orleans Picayune, who witnessed the battle firsthand. The dense chaparral rendered traditional linear tactics obsolete, transforming the conflict into countless isolated skirmishes where individual courage and initiative often proved decisive. By 4:30, General Taylor recognized that the fragmented nature of the battle required a decisive action to unify his forces and break the Mexican line. He ordered Captain William J. Hardy to take the 2nd Dragoons around the Mexican left flank, while simultaneously directing Lieutenant Colonel Childs to lead the artillery battalion against the Mexican center as infantry. General Arista, from his command post behind the Mexican lines, was struggling to coordinate his forces amid the chaos. The unexpected ferocity of the American attacks had disrupted his defensive strategy. Moreover, communication between his units had broken down as the battle spread throughout the chaparral. The pivotal moment came when Captain James Duncan's battery of flying artillery found a path through the brush that allowed him to bring his guns to bear on the Mexican right flank. With remarkable skill, Duncan's artillerymen unlimbered their guns and began firing canister shot into the Mexican positions at close range. The effect was devastating. Duncan's battery tore great gaps in the Mexican formations, recorded Lieutenant Ulysses S. Grant in his post-battle report. Their fire was so accurate and sustained that entire companies of Mexican infantry were compelled to abandon their positions. As the Mexican right began to crumble under Duncan's artillery barrage, Taylor sensed the opportunity and ordered a general advance. The 4th and 5th Infantry surged forward, pushing through the chaparral with bayonets fixed. The Mexicans fought desperately to hold their ground, but the momentum had shifted decisively. Captain Walker's Texas Rangers, familiar with the terrain and expert in the kind of close-quarter fighting the chaparral demanded, played a crucial role in this phase of the battle. Moving in small groups through areas deemed impassable by regular infantry, the Rangers appeared suddenly on the flanks and rear of Mexican positions, creating panic among troops already shaken by the American artillery. By 5 o'clock, the Mexican line began to waver. General Arista, seeing his right flank collapse and his center under increasing pressure, reluctantly gave the order to withdraw. What began as an organized retreat quickly deteriorated into a rout as American forces pressed their advantage. Mexican soldiers abandoned their equipment and fled toward the Rio Grande. Many drowned attempting to cross the river, while others surrendered to the pursuing Americans. The Battle of Resaca de la Palma had ended in a decisive American victory. According to historian Justin H. Smith in The War with Mexico, the psychological impact of Resaca de la Palma on the Mexican army cannot be overstated. Having chosen their ground carefully and prepared defensive positions, they nevertheless found themselves overwhelmed by American arms for the second time in as many days. As the sun began to set over the battlefield, General Taylor rode through the Resaca inspecting the captured Mexican positions. The ground was littered with abandoned weapons, equipment, and the bodies of fallen soldiers from both armies. The Americans had suffered 17 killed and 83 wounded. Mexican casualties were far higher, an estimated 500 killed or wounded with hundreds more taken prisoner. Among the captured materials was General Arista's personal correspondence and the Mexican Army's military chest containing over $30,000. More significantly, the Americans had seized all 8 of the Mexican artillery pieces, trophies of war that would be prominently displayed in Washington, D.C. as evidence of American martial prowess. Lieutenant George Gordon Meade, who would later command the Union Army of the Potomac at Gettysburg during the Civil War, wrote in his journal that evening, "Today's victory, coming so soon after Palo Alto, has assured our dominance north of the Rio Grande. I believe the Mexican forces will not risk another major engagement on this side of the river." As night fell over Resaca de la Palma, neither army fully comprehended the historical significance of the day's events. What they had participated in was not merely a battle for territorial control, but a pivotal moment that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in North America. Dawn broke over the battlefield on May 10, 1846, revealing the full extent of the previous day's carnage. American medical officers worked tirelessly through the night, treating wounded from both armies by lamplight. The moans of injured men carried on the morning breeze as burial details began the somber task of interring the dead. General Taylor established his headquarters in a small clearing near the Resaca and dictated his official report of the battle. His aide, Lieutenant William T. Bliss, recorded the general's words. "It gives me pleasure to report that the victory of the 9th was complete. The enemy has recrossed the Rio Grande, and I am confident is thoroughly disorganized." In the Mexican camp across the river, General Arista faced the bitter task of rebuilding his shattered army. The twin defeats at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma had cost him nearly 1,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing, along with all of his artillery and much of his army's supplies. More devastating than the material losses was the collapse of morale among his remaining troops. Captain Jean-Louis Berlandier, a French naturalist serving with the Mexican forces, described the scene in his journal. "Our army, which had entered the campaign with such high spirits, now finds itself in a state of profound demoralization. The soldiers speak openly of American superiority and question the wisdom of our leadership. Many have deserted during the night, slipping away to nearby villages or attempting to return to their homes farther south." As documented by the San Antonio Herald correspondent who arrived at the battlefield 3 days later, the chaparral remains scarred by artillery fire and littered with abandoned equipment. Most striking are the personal effects left behind by fleeing Mexican soldiers, letters from loved ones, religious medallions, and family portraits, poignant reminders of the human cost of conflict. Taylor wasted no time in capitalizing on his victory. By midday on May 10th, American forces had reached the banks of the Rio Grande opposite Matamoros. The general ordered engineers to construct fortifications and artillery positions overlooking the Mexican town. Within 48 hours, American guns commanded the city, effectively cutting off Arista's retreat route to the south. On May 18th, after a week of tense negotiations conducted under flag of truce, the Mexican forces evacuated Matamoros, retreating deeper into Mexican territory. American troops crossed the Rio Grande and occupied the city without resistance, marking the first American capture of a Mexican settlement in the war. The news of Taylor's victories electrified the United States. When the reports reached Washington, D.C. in late May, they arrived at a critical moment in American politics. President James K. Polk had already asked Congress for a declaration of war on May 11th based on earlier skirmishes along the border. The decisive victories at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma transformed public opinion, generating widespread support for what might otherwise have been a controversial conflict. "The twin victories have ignited patriotic fervor throughout the nation," reported the New York Herald on May 27th. Recruiting offices in every major city are overwhelmed with volunteers eager to join General Taylor's army and share in the glory of conquest. In Mexico City, the reaction was one of shock and dismay. President Mariano Paredes y Arrillaga faced mounting criticism for the military's poor performance. Political factions that had previously supported the government now called for new leadership. The political instability triggered by the defeats would eventually lead to multiple changes in government during the course of the war, severely hampering Mexico's ability to mount an effective defense of its territory. For the soldiers who had fought at Resaca de la Palma, the days following the battle were filled with more immediate concerns. Lieutenant George Meade wrote, "We have established camp outside Matamoros, and the men are finally enjoying regular meals and proper rest. Many still suffer from heat exhaustion and the countless thorns and scratches acquired in the chaparral. Yet morale is extraordinarily high. The men walk with pride, conscious that they have achieved something of historical significance. General Taylor received the official thanks of Congress and was promoted to Major General. Several junior officers who had distinguished themselves at Resaca de la Palma would go on to prominent careers, including Ulysses S. Grant, George Meade, and James Longstreet, all future generals in the American Civil War that would erupt 15 years later. As May turned to June, the American army in Matamoros swelled with reinforcements and volunteers. Taylor began planning the next phase of the campaign, a march deeper into Mexican territory toward Monterrey. The road ahead would prove longer and bloodier than anyone anticipated, but the decisive victory at Resaca de la Palma had set the stage for American military dominance throughout the conflict. According to Colonel Ethan Allen Hitchcock's private journal, recovered decades later and published in the Historical Quarterly Review, what transpired at this small ravine in the Texas Chaparral must be recognized as the true beginning of American continental expansion. In less than 2 hours of combat, the destiny of the continent was forever altered. The battle had lasted just 2 hours, but its consequences would reshape the North American continent for centuries to come. As summer progressed in 1846, the strategic implications of the Battle of Resaca de la Palma began to crystallize. American forces under General Taylor had secured the Rio Grande frontier and established a firm foothold on Mexican soil. More importantly, they had shattered the psychological barrier that had previously made invasion of Mexico seem impossible. No longer did Americans view the Mexican army as a formidable obstacle, wrote Professor Jonathan Layton in his analysis, Manifest Destiny Materialized, published in the Atlantic Monthly. After Resaca de la Palma, the question in American minds shifted from can we win this war to how quickly can we win this war. In Washington, President Polk leveraged the victory to advance his broader territorial ambitions. On June 15th, American diplomats signed the Oregon Treaty with Great Britain, securing the Pacific Northwest up to the 49th parallel. With the northern border settled, Polk could direct the nation's full attention to the southwest. It cannot be coincidence that Britain proved suddenly amenable to compromise in Oregon immediately following news of our victories in Texas, noted Secretary of State James Buchanan in a confidential memorandum to the president. Military success breeds diplomatic advantage. Meanwhile, the soldiers who had fought at Resaca de la Palma adjusted to their new role as an army of occupation. Private Samuel Chamberlain of the 1st Dragoons recorded his impressions of Matamoros in his memoir, My Confession, Recollections of a Rogue. The local inhabitants regard us with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Some shops and homes remain shuttered, while others have reopened for business, their owners pragmatically accepting the new reality. The señoritas peer at us from behind latticed windows, some scowling in resentment, others smiling with perhaps too much friendliness. We are conquerors in a foreign land, a role few of us anticipated when we enlisted. For the Mexican civilians caught in the path of war, life changed dramatically in the wake of the American victory. Doña Margarita Constanza de Lopez, a prominent Matamoros resident, wrote in her diary, "The Americans have established their own courts and bring their own laws. They pay for what they take, which surprises many, but their very presence is an insult to our sovereignty. Yet what can we do but endure? General Arista abandoned us without a fight, taking with him any hope of resistance." Back in the United States, individual stories from the battle captivated the public imagination. Lieutenant Jacob Edmund Blake became a national hero after accounts of his death reached Eastern newspapers. Blake, an engineer officer, had volunteered to scout the Mexican positions before the battle. Riding ahead of the American lines, he had approached so close to the Mexican batteries that he was able to count their guns before being cut down by enemy fire. His final words, reportedly, "Tell the general what I saw," became a rallying cry for recruitment posters. Captain Charles May's cavalry charge against the Mexican artillery was immortalized in numerous engravings and paintings. May himself, with his dramatic appearance and daring exploits, embarked on a speaking tour of eastern cities after the war, drawing large crowds eager to hear first-hand accounts of the battle. Not all stories that emerged from Resaca de la Palma were tales of glory. Sergeant Major John Shackelford of the 5th Infantry wrote to his wife, What the newspapers won't tell you is how Lieutenant Cochrane died, not gloriously charging the enemy, but shot through the head while relieving himself behind a mesquite bush, or how young Wilson from Connecticut was killed by friendly fire in the confusion of the chaparral. War is not the glorious affair they make it out to be in Philadelphia drawing rooms. The Battle of Resaca de la Palma also marked a significant evolution in military tactics. The traditional European-style linear formations proved nearly impossible to maintain in the dense chaparral. Instead, small unit actions dominated the battlefield, with junior officers often making crucial decisions without guidance from higher command. Colonel William Selby, writing in the Military and Naval Chronicle, observed, "The American success at Resaca de la Palma demonstrated the superiority of our officers' initiative and our soldiers' individual marksmanship over the rigid discipline of the Mexican forces. When battle devolved into scattered engagements throughout the brush, American adaptability proved decisive." For Mexican veterans of the battle, the defeat carried lasting consequences. Lieutenant Carlos Mendoza wrote in his unpublished memoirs, recovered from the Mexican National Archives, "Those of us who survived Resaca de la Palma were forever marked by the experience. In the eyes of our countrymen, we became los derrotados, the defeated ones. Many fine officers resigned their commissions rather than bear the shame, while others sought redemption in subsequent battles, often through reckless bravery that claimed their lives." By August 1846, most of the direct participants in the battle had moved on, the Americans pushing south toward Monterrey, the Mexican army regrouping at Linares. But at Resaca de la Palma itself, signs of the conflict remained visible. Local ranchers reported finding human bones, buttons, and bullet-riddled equipment in the chaparral for years afterward. A visiting British military observer, Colonel Arthur Wellesley Thornton, wrote after touring the battlefield in late 1846. "Standing today in this unremarkable ravine, it is difficult to conceive that here, in this thorny wilderness, the fate of nations was decided. Yet such is often the nature of history's pivotal moments. They occur not on grand stages but in obscure locations where men's courage, fear, and determination collide with consequences that echo far beyond the immediate surroundings." As the year progressed, the Battle of Resaca de la Palma gradually transformed from current event to historical milestone, another step in America's march toward what newspaper editor John O'Sullivan had recently termed the nation's manifest destiny. A century and a half after the guns fell silent at Resaca de la Palma, the battle's profound impact on American and Mexican history continues to resonate. What began as a border skirmish ultimately redrew the map of North America and set both nations on dramatically different trajectories. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on February 2, 1848, formally ended the Mexican-American War. Mexico ceded nearly half its territory, including present-day California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. The Rio Grande became the recognized international boundary, permanently establishing the border that General Taylor's forces had fought to secure at Resaca de la Palma. Few military engagements in American history have yielded such disproportionate territorial gains relative to their scale, noted historian Timothy Henderson in his landmark study, A Glorious Defeat, Mexico and its War with the United States. The battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, fought by a few thousand men in the brush of South Texas, set in motion events that would add over 500,000 square miles to the United States. For Mexico, the war and its outcome represented a national catastrophe of immense proportions. Beyond the territorial losses, the psychological impact of defeat lingered for generations, fundamentally altering Mexico's national identity and its relationship with its northern neighbor. Carlos Fuentes, the renowned Mexican novelist and essayist, characterized the war's legacy in his address to the Historical Society of Mexico City. "The trauma of 1846 remains embedded in our national consciousness, the moment when our aspirations as a continental power were irreversibly shattered. From Resaca de la Palma forward, Mexico would define itself in relation to, and often in opposition to, American power." The officers who fought at Resaca de la Palma went on to shape American military development for decades. Of the junior officers present at the battle, 17 would become generals in the Union Army during the Civil War, while 7 would serve as Confederate generals. The experience they gained in Mexico, particularly in small unit tactics and fighting in difficult terrain, would influence their leadership in the much larger conflict that lay ahead. Ulysses S. Grant, who served as a lieutenant in the 4th Infantry at Resaca de la Palma, later reflected in his memoirs, "I do not think there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the United States on Mexico. I thought so at the time when I was a youngster, only I had not moral courage enough to resign." Despite his misgivings about the war's justification, Grant acknowledged that the Mexican campaign had provided invaluable experience for American officers who would later command armies during the Civil War. For General Zachary Taylor, Resaca de la Palma proved a stepping stone to the White House. His victories in Mexico transformed him from an obscure career soldier into a national hero. Capitalizing on his newfound fame, Taylor won the presidential election of 1848, though his presidency would be cut short by his death after just 16 months in office. The battle also left its mark on American culture and literature. Herman Melville's novella, Benito Cereno, contains subtle allusions to the Mexican-American War, while Walt Whitman's poem The Wound Dresser, though explicitly about the Civil War, draws on earlier accounts of field hospitals following battles, like Resaca de la Palma. In the realm of military history, the Battle of Resaca de la Palma represents an important tactical transition. The engagement demonstrated the limitations of European-style linear warfare when confronted with challenging terrain and the need for flexible command structures that could adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. Military historian John S.D. Eisenhower noted in his analysis, "So far from God, the U.S. war with Mexico that Resaca de la Palma foreshadowed many aspects of modern warfare, the importance of individual initiative among junior officers, the decisive impact of superior technology, and the challenges of maintaining command cohesion in restricted visibility conditions." In the border region itself, the battle's legacy is preserved at Resaca de la Palma battlefield, now a state historic site near present-day Brownsville, Texas. Here, amid the still dense chaparral that so challenged both armies, visitors can walk the ground where American and Mexican soldiers fought and died. Archaeological excavations continue to uncover artifacts, bullets, buttons, equipment fragments that offer tangible connections to the men who struggled here. Dr. Elena Garza, curator of the Battlefield Museum, observed in an interview with the Historical Preservation Quarterly, "What strikes visitors most powerfully is the intimate scale of the battlefield. Standing here, one can almost hear the commands being shouted, the discharge of muskets, the clash of bayonets. It reminds us that history, even history that changes the fate of nations, is ultimately made by individual human beings facing moments of extreme challenge." Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Resaca de la Palma lies in the relationship between the United States and Mexico, nations whose destinies were irrevocably intertwined by the events of May 9, 1846. The current border, with its complex mix of cooperation and tension, commerce and security concerns, traces its legal and psychological origins to this battle and the war it helped to decide. Ambassador Carlos Sada Solana, speaking at a binational, historical conference commemorating the battle's sesquicentennial, remarked, "Resaca de la Palma represents both painful division and the possibility of reconciliation. By honestly confronting our shared past, its triumphs and tragedies, its heroism and its cruelties, we create the foundation for a more equitable partnership in the centuries ahead." As the sun sets over the quiet ravine where over 3,000 men once fought for control of a continent, the chaparral reclaims the battlefield. Birds nest in mesquite trees that have grown from soil once soaked with blood. The Rio Grande continues its ancient journey to the Gulf of Mexico. And two nations, once bitter enemies, work to forge a relationship that honors the sacrifice of those who fought at Resaca de la Palma, while building a shared future beyond anything they could have imagined.